It is February 2026, and for the first time in half a century, Saudi Arabia just accepted Chinese yuan for a shipment of crude oil, not as a test, not as a symbolic gesture. As policy, the kingdom that single-handedly propped up the US dollar for 50 years just opened the door to a world where America's currency is optional. But let's get one thing straight before the financial press sanitizes this into a headline you'll forget by lunch. This isn't about one transaction. This isn't about Saudi Arabia being difficult. What you are witnessing is the controlled demolition of the most powerful financial architecture ever built. A system so ingenious, so ruthlessly effective that it allowed one country to print its way to global dominance for 50 years. And the country that built it, the United States of America, and the weapon, not a missile, not a tank, a piece of paper with a dead president's face on it, the US dollar. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants you to ask. How do you convince every country on earth to buy your currency, hold your debt, and fund your deficits voluntarily? How do you make the entire global economy addicted to a piece of paper you can print at will? The answer is oil, and the deal that made it happen is the most consequential financial agreement of the 20th century. One that was never written down, never signed, and is now quietly being unwound. This is the forensic autopsy of the petrodollar, the system that turned black gold into American power, and the slow-motion betrayal that is killing it. This is why Saudi Arabia just killed the petrodollar, and what replaces it. To understand why the petrodollar is dying, you have to understand why it was born. And it was born, like most things in geopolitics, out of pure desperation. Rewind to August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon walks in front of a camera and does something that would reshape the global economy for the next half-century. He kills the gold standard, just like that. No vote in Congress, no international summit, no warning. He walks into a television studio on a Sunday night and announces that the United States will no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system, the post-World War II agreement that pegged the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce and pegged every other currency to the dollar, is dead. Nixon essentially told every government on earth, you know, all those dollars you've been holding, the ones we promised you could exchange for gold at any time. Yeah, about that. We lied, and the world, stunned, had no choice but to accept it. Because what were they going to do? Invade? Now, if you skipped Econ 101, here's the Explain It Like I Am 5 version. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar was basically a gold receipt. Every dollar in circulation was supposed to be backed by actual gold sitting in a vault. But the US had been spending like a trust fund kid with no accountant. Vietnam. The Great Society programs, military bases on every continent. They printed far more dollars than they had gold to back them. France's Charles de Gaulle figured it out first. He started sending ships to New York to exchange dollars for physical gold. Other countries followed. The U.S. gold reserves were hemorrhaging, so Nixon did what any cornered gambler does. He flipped the table, he decoupled the dollar from gold and told the world to just trust him. But here is the problem. Without gold backing the dollar, why would anyone hold it? Why would Japan, Germany, or Saudi Arabia keep their savings in a currency that America could print whenever it felt like it? The dollar was in freefall. Inflation was surging. And for the first time since World War II, America looked economically vulnerable. Then came the gut punch. October 1973. The Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. Arab nations impose an oil embargo against the United States for supporting the Israeli military. Oil prices quadruple overnight, jumping from roughly $3 a barrel to $12 adjusted for inflation. That is like oil going from $30 to $120 in a matter of weeks. Gas lines stretch around city blocks. Speed limits are slashed to 55 miles per hour nationwide. The U.S. creates the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a panic. The American economy, the greatest engine of prosperity in human history, is brought to its knees by a handful of desert kingdoms who simply turned off the taps. And suddenly, the most important commodity on Earth becomes the most dangerous weapon on Earth. This is the moment, the convergence of two crises, a dollar without gold and an economy without oil. And into this chaos walks one of the most cunning diplomats in American history, Henry Kissinger, and he is about to pull off the greatest financial heist the world has ever seen. This is nail number 1. The original sin, the deal with the desert. In 1974, Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh with a proposition so audacious it bordered on extortion. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection for the kingdom, sell them advanced weapons, and guarantee the security of the House of Saud against any threat, foreign or domestic. But there was a second secret component. One so sensitive it wasn't revealed until 2016 when Bloomberg filed a Freedom of Information request. Saudi Arabia would take its surplus oil dollars, the petrodollars, and invest them back into U.S. Treasury bonds. They would recycle the money right back into America's debt. Kissinger even coined the term for it. Petrodollar recycling. Think about the sheer elegance of this con. The U.S. prints dollars. It gives those dollars to Saudi Arabia for oil. Saudi Arabia then loans those dollars back to the U.S. by buying treasury bonds. America gets the oil and the money back. It is like paying your landlord rent with a check. And then the landlord deposits that check right back into your bank account as a loan. You get the apartment, you get the money back. And the landlord thinks he is getting rich because his account shows a big number. But the big number is your IOU. Imagine you run a bar. You pay your bouncer in drink tokens. The bouncer can only spend those tokens at your bar. So you pay him. He buys drinks. The tokens come back to you, and you pay him again with the same tokens. You never actually spend any real money. That is the petrodollar system, and America has been running this bar for 50 years, and it worked. By 1975, every single OPEC nation was pricing oil in dollars. And just like that, the dollar didn't need gold anymore. It had something better. It had oil. Every country on earth needs oil. And if oil is only sold in dollars, every country on earth needs dollars. It created a permanent self-reinforcing demand for the American currency that no amount of money printing could destroy, or so they thought. This is nail number 2, the invisible tax. How the petrodollar let America live beyond its means. Let me put something in perspective for you. The United States national debt is currently approaching $36 trillion. $36 trillion. If you stack that in $100 bills, it would reach from Earth to the moon and back more than twice. How do you accumulate that kind of debt without your economy imploding? How do you run a trade deficit every single year since 1975 and still have the strongest currency on the planet? The answer is the petrodollar. Because the entire world is forced to buy your currency to purchase oil, there is always demand for dollars. And because there is always demand for dollars, there is always demand for US Treasury bonds. And because there is always demand for Treasury bonds, the US government can borrow at insanely low interest rates. Let me translate that into English. Every time you fill up your car in Tokyo, or a factory in Germany orders fuel, or a cargo ship refuels in Singapore, they first have to buy dollars. That transaction creates demand for the dollar. That demand keeps the dollar strong. A strong dollar means the U.S. can import goods cheaply. It means the U.S. can borrow cheaply. It means the U.S. can print money without immediately triggering hyperinflation, because the excess dollars get absorbed by the global economy. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege. The term was coined by French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s, and the French have been furious about it ever since. But whatever you call it, it is the greatest subsidy in human history. The world has been subsidizing America's spending habits for 50 years. Every gallon of oil sold in dollars is a tiny tax on every other nation paid directly to the United States. It funds America's 11 aircraft carriers. It funds 750 military bases in 80 countries. It funds a defense budget that exceeds the next 10 countries combined. And the kicker, most people don't even know it exists. Americans think their prosperity comes from innovation and hard work, and some of it does. But a lot of it comes from the rest of the world being forced to hold and use your currency. That is the exorbitant privilege, and it is expiring. But here's the thing about privileges. They only last as long as nobody questions them, and people are starting to question. This is nail number 3, the cracks in the cathedral. Why the world is losing faith. The first crack appeared in 2022, and it came from the most unexpected place. Washington itself. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. Let that number sink in. 300 billion not seized from oligarchs, not frozen from a drug cartel, frozen from a sovereign nation's central bank. Now, whether you agree with the moral justification or not is irrelevant to the economics. What matters is what every other central banker on the planet thought when they saw this happen. If you can do that to Russia, you can do it to anyone. And suddenly, every country with reserves in dollars had to ask a very uncomfortable question. Is my money actually mine? Or is it only mine as long as Washington approves of my behavior? The reaction was immediate. Central banks around the world began the most aggressive gold buying spree in modern history. In 2022, central banks purchased over 1,100 tons of gold, the highest since records began in the 1950s. In 2023, another 1,050 tons in 2024. Another 1,045. 3 consecutive years of over 1,000 tons. A 3-year buying binge unseen in modern times. Let me put that in perspective. From 2010 to 2021, the average annual central bank gold purchase was about 473 tons. They more than doubled that overnight. China, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore. They were all buying gold like they knew something the rest of us didn't. And what they knew was this: gold cannot be frozen. Gold cannot be sanctioned. Gold doesn't care who the US president is. Gold is the one asset that exists outside the reach of any government. It sits in your vault, silent, patient, answering to no one. No wonder Poland's central bank president publicly stated he wants gold at 20% of total reserves. No wonder China has added over 225 tons to its official reserves since late 2022. No wonder India bought gold every single month of 2024. Adding 73 tons in a single year, 4 times what it bought in 2023. The share of gold in official reserve assets has more than doubled from below 10% in 2015 to over 23%. Now gold is quietly becoming the second largest reserve asset on the planet, surpassing the euro. And unlike the dollar, nobody can print more of it. The dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves has been in freefall. In 2001, it stood at 72%, by 2015 66%, and as of mid-2025 it dropped to roughly 56%. The lowest level in over 30 years. If this pace continues, the dollar share will fall below 50% before the end of this decade. That is not some conspiracy theorist in a bunker. That is the International Monetary Fund's own data. But if you think gold is the real threat to the petrodollar, wait until you meet the dragon. Because the cracks in the cathedral aren't being filled with just gold. They're being filled with yuan. This is nail number 4, the dragon's gambit. China's play for the petro-yuan. Here's a number that should keep every strategist in Washington awake at night. China imports over 11 million barrels of crude oil every single day. It is the largest oil importer on planet Earth and its single biggest supplier, Saudi Arabia. China buys more than 25% of all the oil Saudi Arabia exports. Now think about this from Riyadh's perspective. Your biggest customer is China, not the United States. The US used to be your biggest customer, but thanks to the shale revolution, America is now the world's largest oil producer. It is a net oil exporter. It doesn't need your oil anymore. Not really. So why are you still pricing all your oil in their currency? In March 2018, China launched yuan-denominated crude oil futures contracts on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. This was the opening shot. A direct challenge to the petrodollar's monopoly on oil pricing. For the first time, there was a mechanism to buy and sell oil without touching a single dollar. In November 2023, the People's Bank of China and the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority signed a currency swap agreement worth $7 billion. This allows direct settlement between the yuan and the Saudi rial. No dollars needed, no SWIFT system required, no American bank as a middleman. And then came the masterstroke. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS. not as a casual observer, as a member, alongside China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The kingdom also joined Minbridge, the central bank digital currency project led by China and the Bank for International Settlements, specifically designed for cross-border payments that bypass the dollar. But here is where it gets really interesting. Reports suggest that Saudi Arabia has begun converting some of the yuan it receives from oil sales into physical gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Oil for yuan, yuan for gold, dollars for nothing. They've created a closed loop that cuts America out entirely. Think about the architecture of this. For 50 years, the petrodollar system worked like this. Saudi Arabia sells oil, receives dollars, buys us treasury bonds. America gets its money back. Now the new system works like this. Saudi Arabia sells oil, receives yuan, converts it to gold, stores it in a vault, and America gets nothing. The recycling loop has been broken. But surely, you might say, the dollar is too big to fail. Surely 80% of global oil is still priced in dollars, and you'd be right. For now. Which brings us to nail number 5. The Kingdom's Escape Plan, Vision 2030 and the Great Decoupling. In April 2016, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman unveiled the most ambitious economic transformation plan in the history of the Middle East. He called it Vision 2030. And at its core was one terrifying admission. Saudi Arabia cannot survive on oil forever. Oil currently accounts for 43% of Saudi GDP and roughly 75% of government revenue. The International Energy Agency predicts the world will reach peak oil demand around 2030. If that happens and Saudi Arabia is still a one-trick pony, it is game over. So MBS is building an entirely new economy, NEOM, the $170 billion megacity in the desert. Qiddiya, the entertainment capital that already opened a Six Flags theme park. The Red Sea Project, a luxury tourism destination designed to compete with the Maldives. He is pouring money into AI, biotechnology, renewable energy, and defense manufacturing. The Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, now sits at over $900 billion in assets. The target is $2.7 trillion by 2030. Let me give you a sense of the scale. The PF has invested in everything from Lucid Motors to the Live Golf Tour, from a $50 billion stake in SoftBank's Vision Fund to theme parks and luxury hotels. Saudi Arabia has attracted over 700 global companies to set up regional headquarters in Riyadh, surpassing the 2030 target 5 years early. Active investment licenses have grown tenfold from 6,000 in 2019 to 62,000 by the end of 2025. This isn't a PowerPoint presentation. This is a country rewriting its DNA in real time. And here's the part that matters for the petrodollar. None of this requires the US dollar. When Saudi Arabia buys Chinese technology, it can pay in yuan. When it hires Chinese construction firms for NEOM, it can pay in yuan. When it sells oil to China to fund these projects, it can receive yuan. The more Saudi Arabia diversifies its economy, the less it needs the petrodollar. And the less it needs the petrodollar, the less it needs America. Non-oil economic activity is now expected to account for 57% of Saudi GDP in 2025. Non-oil revenues have increased by over 113% since the 2016 baseline. The private sector's contribution to GDP has reached 47%. Saudi Arabia isn't just talking about diversification, it is executing it. And every percentage point of diversification away from oil is a percentage point of diversification away from the dollar. This is nail number 6. The Triffin Trap, why the system was designed to fail. Now here is the dirty little secret that the architects of the petrodollar never told you. The system contains a fatal flaw. And an economist named Robert Triffin identified it back in 1959. Over a decade before the petrodollar was even born. The Triffin dilemma works like this. For the dollar to serve as the world's reserve currency, the United States must supply the world with dollars. How do you supply the world with dollars? You run trade deficits. You import more than you export. You send dollars overseas. That is the only way dollars end up in foreign hands. But here is the trap. Running perpetual trade deficits means your domestic manufacturing hollows out. Your factories close, your workers lose jobs, your debt balloons. Eventually, the very deficits that made the dollar the world's reserve currency undermine confidence in the dollar itself. It is a financial Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. The United States has run a trade deficit every single year since 1975. 50 years of deficits. The national debt has ballooned from about $500 billion in 1975 to nearly $36 trillion today. That is a 72-fold increase. The debt-to-GDP ratio has climbed from 35% in 1970 to over 124% by the end of 2024. The Congressional Budget Office projects it will exceed 155% by 2055. And the human cost of this system is sitting in the hollowed-out towns of Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The petrodollar made imports so cheap that American manufacturing couldn't compete. Between 2000 and 2020, the U.S. lost roughly 5 million manufacturing jobs. Entire cities that once built cars, steel, and furniture became ghost towns of opioid clinics and dollar stores. The petrodollar made Wall Street rich and Main Street poor, and nobody told the factory workers that their jobs were the price of America's financial empire. Let me translate that into language the policy papers won't use. America sacrificed its working class on the altar of the petrodollar. It traded factories for finance. It traded production for privilege, and the privilege is now evaporating, but the factories aren't coming back. Let me translate that. America is borrowing from the future at a pace that is mathematically unsustainable. And the only reason it hasn't crashed yet is because the petrodollar forces the world to keep lending. But what happens when the world decides it doesn't want to lend anymore? What happens when the single biggest buyer of your debt starts buying gold instead? That is not a hypothetical. Foreign ownership of U.S. Treasury bonds has dropped from over 50% during the global financial crisis to about 30% as of early 2025. The biggest buyer is no longer showing up to the auction. And that right there is the sound of the petrodollar's life support machine starting to beep. This is nail number 7, the weapon that backfired. How sanctions accelerated the collapse. Remember when we talked about Russia's $300 billion being frozen? That was the accelerant, but the fire had been burning for years. The United States has weaponized the dollar more aggressively than any country has weaponized any currency in history. SWIFT, the global messaging system that facilitates international payments, processes roughly $5 trillion in transactions every single day. And the U.S. effectively controls access to it. If Washington doesn't like you, you get cut off. Iran cut off, North Korea cut off, Russia cut off, Venezuela cut off. Even European companies that tried to do legitimate business with Iran were threatened with secondary sanctions. A French bank, BNP Paribas, was fined nearly $9 billion for processing payments that were perfectly legal under French law but violated American sanctions. $9 billion for following its own country's laws. Think about what that means. If you are a bank in Berlin or a manufacturer in Milan or an oil trader in Dubai, and you touch a US dollar at any point in your transaction, you are subject to American law, not your own country's law. American law. The dollar isn't just a currency. It is a jurisdiction, one that extends far beyond America's borders. And people are getting tired of living under someone else's legal system. And here is the ironic part. Every time America uses the dollar as a weapon, it gives the rest of the world one more reason to find an alternative. If your most important financial tool is also your most dangerous weapon, eventually people stop wanting to use the tool. Russia, after being cut from SWIFT, pivoted entirely to selling oil to China and India in yuan and rupees. In 2024, China and India were the largest buyers of Russian crude, accounting for 81% of Russia's oil exports. Iran has been trading oil in yuan for years. Even U.S. allies started building alternatives. Europe created Instex, a special-purpose vehicle to trade with Iran without using dollars. China built CEPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, which now processes over 26 trillion yuan per year. India launched its own unified payments interface that now processes over 12 billion transactions a month domestically and is expanding internationally. Brazil and Argentina announced plans to create a common currency for bilateral trade. Even the United Arab Emirates, one of America's closest allies in the region, has started settling some oil trades in dirhams. These are not theoretical threats. These are operational systems already moving real money outside the dollar ecosystem. The more you weaponize the dollar, the faster you accelerate its replacement. It is like a landlord who keeps changing the locks on his tenants. Eventually, the tenants build their own house. This is nail number 8, the 80% illusion, why the petrodollar looks stronger than it is. Now, defenders of the dollar will point to one very real number. Roughly 80% of global oil transactions are still denominated in dollars. That is true, but it is misleading. Here is why. Global crude oil exports totaled roughly $1.26 trillion in 2024. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for $191 billion of that, roughly 15% of all crude exports on Earth. That sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but zoom out further. The total global foreign exchange market trades about $7.5 trillion every single day. Oil is less than 0.02% of daily forex volume. The idea that oil alone props up the dollar is a relic of the 1970s when oil trade was a massive chunk of global commerce. Today, it is a rounding error in the daily flow of global capital. The real pillar of dollar dominance is the broader financial infrastructure. Treasury markets, SWIFT, derivative contracts, trade invoicing, the depth of American capital markets. Oil was the foundation. But the building has long since outgrown the foundation, and here is the dangerous part. Once you realize the foundation doesn't matter as much as it used to, you start to realize the foundation can be removed without the building collapsing. And that realization is what is giving Saudi Arabia the courage to diversify. The danger isn't that Saudi Arabia will suddenly announce all oil is now priced in yuan. That would crash their own economy since the rial is pegged to the dollar. The danger is gradual. It is death by 1,000 cuts. A few percent here, a bilateral deal there, a new settlement system over there, each one tiny, each one on its own. Meaningless, but together over a decade, they rewire the entire global financial plumbing. And that is exactly what is happening. Russia sells oil in yuan, Iran sells oil in yuan, Venezuela sells oil in yuan, the UAE has started settling some trades in dirhams, India and Russia settle in rupees. Every one of these transactions is a drop of acid on the petrodollar's armor. And the armor is getting thinner. Speaking of things getting thinner, this channel's ability to keep producing these forensic deep dives depends entirely on you. If this analysis is hitting different from the recycled takes you see everywhere else, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing. It tells the algorithm this is worth watching. And frankly, understanding the death of the petrodollar is going to matter a lot more to your life than the next viral cat video. Just saying. This is nail number 9, the successor problem. Why there is no petro yuan, and why that makes it worse. Now here is the twist that most analysis gets wrong. The petrodollar isn't being replaced by the petro yuan. It isn't being replaced by a petro anything. And that is actually more dangerous than a clean swap. If the yuan were going to simply replace the dollar, China would need to do everything America did. Open capital markets, freely convertible currency, massive trade deficits to export yuan globally, deep and liquid bond markets, rule of law protecting foreign investors. China has none of these things. The yuan still has capital controls. The Chinese government manipulates its exchange rate. Foreign investors can't freely move money in and out of China. The yuan accounts for roughly 2% of global reserves compared to 56% for the dollar. It isn't even close. But here is what is happening instead. The world is fragmenting. Instead of one reserve currency replacing another, we're moving toward a multipolar currency world. The dollar, the euro, digital currencies. Bilateral swap agreements, regional settlement systems. Think of it less like a king being replaced by a new king and more like a king being replaced by a council of warlords. Nobody's fully in charge. And that chaos, paradoxically, is worse for America than a clean yuan takeover would be. Because if there was one clear replacement, America could compete. It could negotiate. It could offer a better deal. But you can't compete against fragmentation. You can't outbid chaos when 20 countries each build their own small settlement system. and each one drains a tiny fraction of dollar demand. The erosion is invisible until it is irreversible. History has a perfect analogy for this. The British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency for over a century. It didn't lose that status to a single challenger. It lost it gradually, over 3 decades from the 1920s to the 1950s, as the British Empire contracted and the world diversified. There was no single day the pound died. There was just a slow, irreversible decline in relevance. And by the time London noticed, it was too late to reverse. The dollar story is rhyming with the pound's different decade. Same melody. It is not a tsunami. It is a tide. And tides don't care about seawalls. This is nail number 10. The Saudi calculation. Why Riyadh is hedging its bets. Let's get inside the head of Mohammed bin Salman for a moment. He is in his late 30s. He is running a kingdom that sits on roughly 267 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. He knows peak oil demand is coming. He knows America doesn't need his oil anymore. He knows China does. He also knows that his grandfather's deal with Kissinger was made in a fundamentally different world. In 1974, America consumed 20 million barrels a day and produced barely 10. America needed Saudi oil. Today, America produces over 13 million barrels a day and is a net exporter. America doesn't need Saudi oil, but China, importing over 11 million barrels daily, needs it desperately. So MBS is doing what any rational actor would do. He is diversifying, not abandoning the dollar, not declaring war on Washington, just quietly, methodically, building alternative channels. A yuan swap line here, a BRICS membership there, a gold conversion mechanism on the side. He is giving himself options. Because in geopolitics, the only thing more dangerous than having enemies is having only one friend. And the United States has made that diversification easier by being a terrible friend. Washington failed to support Saudi Arabia in Yemen. It tried to cut a nuclear deal with Iran, Saudi Arabia's existential enemy. It called for regime change after the Khashoggi affair. It threatened secondary sanctions on Saudi allies. And then it weaponized the very financial system the Saudis helped build. After 50 years of loyal partnership, of pricing every barrel in dollars, of recycling every surplus into treasury bonds, the Saudis watched Washington freeze Russia's reserves and thought, that could be us. If I were MBS, I'd be diversifying too. And the economic data suggests he already is. Saudi Arabia exported roughly $191 billion in crude oil in 2024. It is still the world's largest crude oil exporter. But the direction of those exports has shifted dramatically toward Asia, and with it, slowly the currency composition. This is nail number 11, the dollar's last stand. What actually holds it together? Now, before you start stuffing cash under your mattress or converting your savings to gold bars, let me be clear about something. The petrodollar is dying, but the dollar is not dead. There is a crucial difference. The dollar is still bought or sold in 88% of all foreign exchange transactions. It still dominates trade invoicing at around 54%. The U.S. Treasury market, at roughly $27 trillion, is the deepest and most liquid bond market on Earth. There is no alternative that comes close. Not the euro, not the yuan, not gold, not Bitcoin. The dollar's real strength was never just oil, it was trust. Trust in American institutions, trust in the rule of law, trust in the depth and liquidity of American capital markets. Trust that if you park $1 trillion in treasury bonds, you can get it back tomorrow. No other country on earth can offer that. Not yet. The euro comes close. But the Eurozone is a collection of 17 different fiscal policies pretending to be one. The yuan is controlled by an authoritarian government that manipulates its value. Gold is stable but illiquid. Bitcoin is a casino masquerading as a currency. The dollar wins by default. But winning by default is not the same as winning. But here is the warning: trust is not a permanent asset. It is a depreciating one. And America has been spending its trust reserves almost as recklessly as its financial ones. Weaponizing SWIFT erodes trust. Freezing sovereign assets erodes trust. Running $36 trillion in debt erodes trust. Political instability erodes trust. Every time Washington does something that makes the world question American reliability, it shaves a fraction off the dollar's dominance. And those fractions compound. The petrodollar isn't going to die with a bang. There will be no announcement, no formal declaration, no single day when the world wakes up and the dollar is worthless. It will die the way Hemingway described going bankrupt. Gradually, then suddenly. So here we are. The verdict is in. The petrodollar, the most ingenious financial system of the 20th century, is in terminal decline. Not because any single country killed it, but because the conditions that created it no longer exist. It wasn't just Saudi Arabia, it was physics. The physics of debt, the physics of trust, and the physics of a world that no longer has one superpower calling all the shots. Here is the final bill. 1. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 72% to roughly 56% in 24 years, a loss of 16 percentage points of global confidence. 2. Central banks have purchased over 3,200 tons of gold in just 3 years, 2022 through 2024, the largest accumulation since the 1950s, a $350 billion bet against the dollar. 3. The share of foreign ownership in U.S. Treasury bonds has fallen from over 50% to 30%. The world is lending America less money. 4. At least 7 countries are now actively conducting oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. The monopoly is broken. And 5. Saudi Arabia, the country that birthed the petrodollar in 1974, has joined BRICS, signed a yuan currency swap, and begun converting oil receipts to gold. The midwife has become the pallbearer. And here is the number that should haunt every Treasury official in Washington. J.P. Morgan estimates that Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even oil price is roughly $98 per barrel. That means the kingdom needs oil at nearly $100 just to balance its budget. But Brent crude is forecast to average around $60 in 2025. That is a $40 gap per barrel. And when your budget is bleeding, you don't have the luxury of pricing loyalty. You price survival. If China offers to fill that gap with investment, infrastructure, and currency swaps, MBS would be economically irrational to say no. There will be analysis, there will be debate, there will be 1,000 op-eds saying the dollar is fine, everything is fine, this is all overblown. And in the short term, they might be right. The dollar isn't dying tomorrow, but in the long term, the architecture is crumbling. The foundation is cracking and the tenants are already looking for new apartments. America built the most powerful financial system in history by making a handshake deal with a desert kingdom 50 years ago. And that system gave America the ability to print money, fight wars, run deficits, and live beyond its means for half a century. It was the greatest economic magic trick ever performed. But the magician is getting old. The audience is getting wise in Saudi Arabia. The lovely assistant who made the trick work. She is leaving the show, not with a dramatic exit, not by storming off stage, just by quietly, politely opening a side door and stepping into the night while the audience is still watching the magician fumble with his next trick. The question isn't whether the petrodollar will die. It is whether America can build something new before the old system collapses around it. And right now, looking at the debt, the deficits, the political chaos, and the complete absence of a plan B, the answer to that question should terrify you. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, subscribe, because the next chapter, the one about what America does when the world stops lending it money, is going to be the most important economic story of this decade. I'll see you in the comments, and remember, economics isn't just about money, it is about power, and power, like oil, eventually runs dry.